The second presentation will be done by Stephen Woloshin, bias associated with publication of interim results of randomized trials. Please, Stephen.
Great, thank you. Okay, so let's start with disclosures. Our co-authors have no disclosures, but Lisa and I have three. First, we're married to each other. Secondly, the peer review Congress is our favorite meeting. And third, we're both expert witnesses in testosterone litigation. So publication of interim results can introduce uncertainty and inflate treatment effects. The results tend to be imprecise because there are a smaller number of events. And prior research has shown that interim results tend to overinflate treatment effects, which can be a problem because results may change over time. That could mislead clinicians and providers and patients. Interim results can also undermine the integrity of trials because it can interfere with recruitment, it could encourage unblinding, and it can encourage dropouts and crossovers. So we got interested in this topic when a reporter approached us about a newly approved drug for advanced breast cancer. And it turned out that the trial, a phase 3 trial, was approved on the basis of interim results by the FDA, and the trial was also reported in a medical journal. And what it showed was that the interim progression-free survival was about a 4-month improvement with the drug. Overall survival results were presented as well, but they were deemed immature because there were few events. About a year later, the final progression-free survival results were reported, confirming the interim report. And then in a separate publication, final overall survival results were reported, and here the conclusion was that the drug had no effect on survival. And looking at these three papers, we noticed something curious. What we noticed was that the interim results, so the ones associated with the most uncertainty, were published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is, of course, one of the most, the highest impact factor journals in the world. But the final publications, which FDA used to change the label, appeared in journals with much, much lower impact factors. And at no point did the New England Journal make mention of or link to any of the final results. And that is what motivated our study to describe publication of interim results from ongoing trials and compare prominence and consistency with final publication. We searched PubMed 2006 to 2015 looking for randomized trials with the words interim, not mature, or immature in the title or in the abstract. We found 1,267 articles. We excluded completed pilot studies, protocols, cancer trials with final primary outcomes like progression-free survival, but an interim secondary outcome such as overall survival. And that left us with 613 trials reporting interim results of ongoing trials. Of these, 442 were stopped early, either for benefit, harm, or futility, and that left us a final pool of 171 articles, which were ongoing trials reporting interim results for efficacy or safety. The reason for the interim publication was stated in 40% of the papers as being protocol-specified analyses. But 50% of the time, the paper didn't state a reason for the interim analysis anywhere, so there was no information why it was done. The remaining 10%, the authors gave a variety of reasons. For example, one author said that they were afraid of being scooped by rival investigators, and that's what prompted the publication. Another case, an investigator said it would be really helpful for an upcoming grant submission to have a publication done, and that was the reason for this interim publication. These trials were published largely in oncology and surgery, and almost half were solely or partly industry funded. To find the final publications, we searched PubMed, Trials.gov, Web of Science, using registry numbers if available, PubMed IDs, and we also searched names of the authors of interim publications as well. And if we were unable to find a final publication, we also tried to contact authors of the interim publication using their emails. We restricted our analysis to the 158 ongoing interim trials where there was sufficient time for a final publication, which we defined as at least 1 year past the registry-defined completion date. We found 90 final publications corresponding to the interim publications. So just over half of the interim publications had a final publication. Among these, 72 were matched interim and final publications reporting the same primary outcome results. So did interim and final abstract conclusions change qualitatively? What we found was that in 85% of the time, they didn't change. The qualitative conclusion was the same, but 15% of the time they did. 8% became weaker. For example, the interim publication said the carpecitabine-containing chemotherapy regimen reduced breast cancer recurrence compared with a control schedule of standard agents. But the final publication said the regimen did not improve recurrence-free survival. So in other words, the result flipped from helped to did not help. 7% of the time, the conclusions became stronger. For example, the interim report concluded that after 4 weeks, 5% lidocaine-medicated plaster treatment was associated with similar levels of analgesia, but the final report concluded that 5% lidocaine-medicated plaster showed better efficacy. So in this case, the result flipped from the drug not being not better to being better. We also found that interim and final publications had similar prominence. For example, about the same proportion appeared in high impact factor journals. We defined that as impact factor greater than or equal to 20. They were also equally likely to be in the top 5 impact factor journals. Among the 19%, this 19%, only 1/3 also appeared in a top 5 journal in the final form. We also looked at traditional and social media prominence using the altometric rating, and again, there was no difference between the interim and final publication. So let me talk about the limitations. We may have underestimated interim publication prevalence because not all interim publications use the word interim in the title or the abstract. And we avoided very nonspecific terms like preliminary because we got way too many results. In addition, we may have underestimated the final publication rate because we may have missed final publications in our searches. And when no final publications came up in our searches, I said we tried to contact authors, but only about half responded to our queries. In addition, trial registry completion dates may not be up to date, so it's possible that some trials that were not ripe for final publication, so less than 1 year from the trial completion date, may have gotten into the denominator, which would, the result would be it would underestimate the final publication rate. We also may be understating the extent of interim to final changes because we only assessed primary outcomes, but secondary outcomes, for example, overall survival, may be the most clinically important outcomes of all. So in summary, many interim publications report analyses that are not pre-specified or lack a compelling justification. Frequent non-publication may cause bias since the treatment effects remain unknown. And interim and final publications have similar journal and media prominence, although the conclusions may change. So what can journals do? Well, one thing would be to limit publication of interim results from ongoing trials to those with a reasonable justification. So, for example, requiring that they're pre-specified in the protocol and that they have a reasonable number of outcomes so the results are stable. The other thing would be to limit the publication to cases least likely to cause bias. So, for example, trials where recruitment is complete and there are no ongoing treatments. When journals do choose to publish interim results, there's a few things they can do. One would be to highlight the interimness and the justification for the interim publication. Let me show you what I mean. We'll go back to, this is the study that inspired this project. One thing that the journal could do in order to highlight the interimness of the publication to readers would be to include it in the title, right? This was a pre-planned interim analysis, and they could easily put this in the title. When a study is not a pre-planned, when there's an unplanned interim analysis, it would be really refreshing to see titles like this. The other thing that journals can do is to highlight to readers the existence of the final results. So a lot of journals will have links to related articles. That's pretty routine nowadays. What we're thinking is that it would be great to also link to the final results. So the journals can do that in a bunch of ways. One would be to have their own summary of the final results, or they could link externally to the published trial, or they could link to regulatory sites, if that's where the final results appear, or and so on. And the other thing they can do is, if there are no final reports, they could say the final results have not been reported, to make that crystal clear to readers. Thank you.
Questions, please. Do you think some authors are using this term interim or preliminary or whatever just to hide the fact that recruitment was very difficult, that the study did not really advance, and that just want to publish that stuff?
It's possible that just like the discussion before about some of the other terms, the terms interim and publication probably are not well defined. It may mean different things to different people. But in the end, I think if the journals are, really take a stand that you've got to have a good reason for it, and then are really clear so that readers understand the interim nature of the publication, I think that would help.
Lisa?
Thank you. You showed some great quotes from the conclusions, and I'm just wondering, did you look at the main changes in the results themselves? Was it just a narrowing of uncertainty, or what were the changes there? Yeah,
that's a great question. So we focused on looking at the abstract results, but that's a great idea. We ought to take a look when we do our final publication. These are interim results.
Just, please.
Ivan Oransky from Retraction Watch. Very interesting, and I'm wondering, and I'm probably going to mangle the term here a little bit, but if you were to do a sort of intent to treat analysis and figure that all of the studies that where you couldn't find final, publication or final result publication had the quote-unquote negative outcome, or the sort of a different outcome, do you think this would look very different? I mean, I have my biases, of course, but what do you think that might look like?
You mean you're suggesting that maybe the unpublished were all negative trials?
Well, I'm not saying that they necessarily were, but if you were to do an analysis as if that were your sort of an intention to treat analysis, if that was the case.
Well, I don't know the answer, but I think that would be really great to know. I mean, this is a real great source of bias, and so that's a great project. Thank you.
Fiona?
I think it builds slightly on that, Fiona Godley from BMJ. I think that's such a great data set you've got there, and it may not be big enough to look at, but I wonder whether when things became weaker, if you do a subgroup analysis of that group, whether they were more likely to be published in less high-profile journals. I mean, it's that. You didn't present an analysis. It maybe not enough data to do that, but.
Right, we didn't. The number of trials is not that big, but I think we could do that. We could take a look at that, and that would be interesting to see.
And Mark Helfand again. Steve, very nice.
Hey.
Can you? I have a quibble with one of the conclusions, but I can't remember it unless you go back to the conclusion slide. So could you reel back a little bit? And I know it's going to be a lot.
Oh, it's the other way. Sorry. So the conclusion.
Hold on. It says frequent non-publication. The one before this.
Before this.
Yeah, I think.
This way.
Frequent non-publication may cause bias since final treatment effects remain unknown. Well, since your study's an interim analysis, when a study is terminated early for benefit or harm, all right, that usually means they're not going to recruit anybody else, but it may mean but they may be able to follow people up to longer to the intended amount of follow-up time. So if they terminated when everybody had, an average of 4 months, but the protocol said 12, there's nothing stopping them from having a final treatment effect that's different. So I would back to that slide. So
yeah, I don't know who's doing
so
that.
It's not. Yeah, sorry, but if you go back to the.
Yeah,
so
sorry.
frequent
I'm not
non-publication.
touching it.
Yeah, what actually would be needed is to look at those that were terminated early for benefit and see from clinical trials results or something whether in fact they had a follow-up analysis, because they may have followed people longer.
Yeah, that's it. I'll look at one again. I don't know who's doing that. That's a great point. Just to stress, we didn't look at trials that were stopped early for benefit. We looked at trials that were ongoing. But your point is great. And some people have, I think we saw a couple of studies actually looking at that, but I think that's really important.
Yeah, just, again, it's off the slide, but the point is that conclusion or that summary point refers to the ones that you didn't look at, the ones that were, it includes those that were stopped for benefit, so that's why I brought it up.
Okay, thank you. Quibble accepted.
Please.
Hal Sox from Picori. Steve, I'm wondering whether the biology of the disease that's being treated may be a confounder, and that some diseases by their nature just end up with bad results, like advanced breast cancer, where others you wouldn't necessarily see the biology driving control and intervention together.
Well, that's certainly true, but it would, there's no reason not to be clear about what it is an interim publication, what's a final publication, and letting people, highlighting that to people so they're looking for it, and being aware of the fact that things do change. And while the biology may confound what happens in the end, it's still a matter of transparently reporting what evidence you've gathered and then presenting in a way that it's clear to readers.
Thank you.
Steve?
Hi. Whoa. Sorry. Steve Goodman from Stanford Metrics. So this is a really interesting study in terms of irony on the issue of stop trials, not the ones that continued. There actually was a publication a number of years ago that purported to show that they had a huge bias. A number of people, including myself, pointed out and that was published in one of the top Trial 5 journals, that had a methodologic error. And then the authors, about 5 or 6 years later, ultimately conceded that was an error and sort of modified their interpretation. The first paper had about 500 citations. The subsequent paper had maybe 12. So that's an irony on top of an irony that showed that interim results had a benefit, and that interim report was not right and referenced too much. But my question is, wasn't this in a sense a selected sample of trials that continued because people weren't sure enough about the results so that they didn't stop them early? So trials that are stopped early for benefit and reported at that point, they're usually reported, and that's the last report, because they're pretty sure that this is the truth, either because they use stopping rules or a variety of other reasons. So if they continue, that's exactly the situation in which people think that the book is not closed. And I was very interested to see that 85% of them, in fact, didn't change, and the remaining 50% split 50-50 going both directions, which vindicated that judgment. They're pretty sure it was worth reporting, but they kept going, and it sort of was the flip of a coin where it went. Is that a right interpretation? And doesn't this, in a sense, vindicate their judgment? Even though I'm very delighted to hear that the final report was sort of cited as, just as prominent as the early one.
I'm sorry, vindicate which judgment?
The judgment that they really weren't sure enough about what was going on, and the trial merited continuing.
Right. I mean, I think I may be giving a little too much credit, because a lot of times we'd have no idea why they were continuing. And the few times when I gave some examples of crazy reasons, but you're probably right. And but that's why we have final results. So it's good that the trials keep going. I mean, interim publication is sometimes appropriate. Final publication is really crucial.
Yeah. No, I wasn't taking issue with the results. I was just wondering about the selection process. But anyway, very, very nice piece.
Yeah, and we enjoyed your paper about stopping for nothing. That was.
Yeah, that was it.
That was great. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.